Zadie Smith said to me, literature as we know it will last your time, but I don't think it'll last mine. But I think then it will go back to what it was when I started out, which is a minority interest sphere. And no one minded it being that in 1970.
This is the first episode of my Martin Amis that takes place in my living room, for once. I am pleased to be able to introduce and host a guest that appeared in the last episode, that is the live episode from the 23rd of March, where we brought together a stellar panel to talk about the life and legacy of Martin Amis. His name is Vincenzo Barney, by far the furthest traveled of all of the guests for that live show, who's been hopping around Europe ever since, from Amsterdam to Greece, is that right? And now back in the UK to talk about his chosen Amis novel, The Zone of Interest. Vincenzo, great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very honored, and might I say you're an excellent host. Not only does Jack bring you on the podcast, but he hosts you for 2 nights and takes you to a good pub, so I recommend doing the My Martin Amis podcast.
This could become the regular hotel/studio.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Maybe there's a business in there I haven't quite thought of yet. Well, listen, last night, while you were getting settled upstairs, I watched The Zone of Interest.
Oh, fantastic.
Jonathan Glazer's haunting, just very, very affecting movie that came out, I believe, in 2023. Am I right?
Yes, I believe so.
Based on the novel that came out in 2014, and which corrected for a lot of bad adaptations of Amis's novels in the past. I'm thinking particularly of London Fields here.
The movie is incredible. I think it's a very loose adaptation of the plot of The Zone of Interest, but it's absolutely a sincere adaptation, very close adaptation of the actual theme of the novel. And the achievement of the film is Amis's achievement. Eerily enough, it premiered in Cannes the day of Martin Amis's death.
Yes, it did.
And it absolutely is by far the greatest adaptation of any of his books, and I think, as you said, makes up for all the bad ones. But the achievement of the film is the achievement of the novel, which is to show the horrors of the Holocaust without actually revealing them, keeping everything, keeping the camera, keeping the prose just a hair's breadth this side of the walls. And in doing that, the film focuses more perhaps on the bureaucratic banality of these Nazi officers. The wife, Hedwig, she doesn't want to transfer. She's made a home here. Meanwhile, you have smoke plumes rising over walls in the background of her garden. You see actually how mediocre and human these people are, which makes the event all the more monstrous. In the novel, there's much more nuance. I mean, there's certain characters. I can understand why Glazer didn't do a direct adaptation of the novel itself. The novel focuses on 3 main narrators. Thomsen, who's the nephew of Martin Bormann, who's sort of a very effete Nazi who, when asked what he does, he says, "I liaise." You know, he's sort of a quintessential Amis character in a way. There's something very effete and effeminate about him, but also he's a prolific philanderer. He falls in love with the other main narrator, Paul Dahl's wife, Hannah. Hannah's not one of the narrators, but Paul Dahl is, and he's sort of an absurdist character. He's sort of a satire of Rudolf Hess, who is one of the main characters in the novel, the film adaptation. But I think Amis achieves more that really could only be done in a novel. I don't know how you would have really shown the absurdity of a very effete philandering Nazi officer in a film. I don't think it really would have worked. I think that's best for the armchair and a nice reading light, you know.
You've alluded to it there, but the premise of the story is this German family, the patriarch of which is Rudolf Hess, the Auschwitz commandant, praised by peers, colleagues, and those above in the Nazi order for his ingenuity, his loyalty. And the sense you get throughout the film, just to talk a little bit about how it's filmed, is of this, as I say, really haunting sense of light and shade. What's just around the corner of this beautiful estate that the family has managed to create and cultivate. You see gardens, the most beautiful flowers. Around the corner from there, you see the barbed wire, you see the watchtowers, you see people moving in the watchtowers, you see the workers who are tending to the gardens and the housemaids, etc., all milling around. It's this really bizarre not just juxtaposition, but this fact of a family having tried to build Eden in hell, a place that can't withstand what's going on outside. And there are moments in the film, of course, where all of that seeps in. Perhaps we can just talk about the title for a minute, The Zone of Interest. What does this refer to?
It was a name given to the actual area that they're in. This camp is the Zone of Interest, one of the centers of the Holocaust. What the film does exactly is what the novel does, which is to create a really diabolical juxtaposition. The film, there's an incredible moment where I think it just focuses on a flower growing on one side of the wall, and the flower looks absolutely evil for even existing this close to the horror that you know is going on the other side. And the novel too has sort of maybe some reminiscences that take place just outside the wall, where the commandant doll is describing a detraining that goes horribly awry, where they're tricking the Jews that they're bringing in into thinking that they're coming to a farm, and suddenly some lorry comes up and the door is open and you see all these dead bodies. And it's actually an incredible moment where the prisoners, I suppose, can't take in what they've just seen. And so Commandant Paul Dahl panics, thinking, how is he going to right this situation? But actually the vision of these dead bodies is too intense for the prisoners to really take in and understand what's going on, and they continue walking right into the camp. So the film is a success in achieving, I think, a similar, very stark dynamic where you're always, there's a juxtaposition. You know what's happening on the other side of the wall, and that's constantly creeping into what's happening on the civilian side, on the German side. You're constantly haunted by that. It's a huge weight holding you down. In the novel, you get moments where they're going about their day, but there's a terrible smell. There's a terrible warpage of light coming off the burning bodies. You know, you see these things in the distance, and it's slowly, it is eating away at these people, but they're trying to affect normality.
And the sound as well. This film has been praised for its soundscape. Ever present is this ambience of what's happening in Auschwitz and the incredible obliviousness with which people are enduring sounds every day, but it's becoming so much part of the background that they barely notice it. The only time they really do is when the smoke chimneys from the ovens produce such toxicity that people develop subtle coughs. It's a really hard watch. You almost feel in some way culpable yourself for sensing what's going on, but not confronting it as the viewer.
I think the novel gets at this even deeper because it's written in a English idiom. So you have these Nazi officers who are saying, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound. They're talking in a very, you know, heavy English dialect, not heavy, but in English dialect.
Yeah.
And this is something that Amos attempted with House of Meetings. He wrote his Soviet novel also in the same way, but I don't think it works in that novel. That novel, it feels forced and odd and out of place. But with this, when you're reading the Holocaust actually in the English language, even though I'm American, so it's not written in my dialect, but it's written in a dialect I understand, it makes it more relatable. You can see the Holocaust happening in the English language. It makes it more real. You know, the German language itself is so harsh. Even in an Inside Story, I think there's a great footnote where Amos is talking about, can we even imagine the Holocaust in the French language? It's such a soft, you know, pretty language, but with German, you know, the Schnell, the Raus, the way that they speak is so harsh in itself that I think creates an obstacle sometimes with non-German speakers, with English speakers. You know, you can see it as, you can look at the Holocaust and the Nazis and say, this is something other. But actually, when it's rendered into the English language, you can almost read your own consciousness into it. You can read yourself into it, and it becomes more human. It becomes almost more eventual seeming. And this is something that can't be done in the film. You know, this is something that is really only within the domain of only attemptable really in the domain of the novel. And it's part of the disarming too. I mean, the achievement of the novel, which is not in the film, is the amount of ironic humor, the dark humor he's able to pull off, which I think he was criticized for, but I think it plays into this relatability. I mean, he brings you right up close to these characters where you can understand them. Even though some of them are slightly absurd, you can see yourself ironically transposed into them in a way that the film doesn't do. I think I would almost say it's his Lolita in the sense that he's able to bring in real poetic, aesthetic beauty into the most evil situation of mankind.
You consider it his masterpiece, don't you?
At least a masterpiece of his second half of his career, but I think there's a good chance that it could be the greatest novel he ever wrote. It's certainly when he recovered to the peaks of his previous works. I think if you nudge his body of work a little bit, you can split them into two separate octaves. If you take out the essays, the short story collections, and you include Experience, the memoir, in his corpus, you can split them right down the middle between Time Zero and The Information and Night Train. I think there's a huge cleavage point when his father Kingsley dies. I think this hit him right when he was in the middle of a midlife crisis. I think he had been operating in a sort of literary princedom for the first half of his career, and without Kingsley, he couldn't stand to be a literary orphan. One of the first things he does after Kingsley dies is he calls up Saul Bellow and he says, you'll have to do now. You'll have to be my father.
That's right. As you said in the live show, he laid the flat of the sword on his shoulder, pretty much. It was a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, and Bellow accepted.
Yeah.
So he was an enfant terrible, but when Kingsley died, I think he missed the moment where he could have stepped into being a real major writer and being on his own, but he didn't. He remained enfant in some ways. He sought to remain a prince. So he laid the flat of a sword on another writer. Kingsley also, he was said famously in the last years of his life, I will never read another novel that doesn't begin with a shot rang out. He was only going to read genre novels. The very first novel that Martin writes after Kingsley's death is Night Train, which is such an aberration in his body of work. It is a genre novel. It begins with a suicide. It's a whodunit. It's a police detective story. I think in a way, it's sort of an homage to Kingsley. And I think after that, Experience is still a masterpiece, but that is still written within the lineage of Kingsley. It's all about Kingsley. After that, I think he really stumbles for quite a while, and he doesn't really know which way to go in. Yellow Dog is much better than people make it seem. It's better than The House of Meetings, for instance. It's better than Lionel Asbo. But he's sort of tossing about, and it's not until... with The Pregnant Widow, I think he recovers on the level of The Sentence.
Yes.
It's one of his most beautifully written books.
I'd agree, yeah.
But
absolutely.
It's very tangential. It's Saul Bellow at his best and worst. It's beautifully written, but it sort of goes on too long. It kind of goes nowhere. It's too tangential. But with The Zone of Interest, it's so sleek. It's such a tour de force of style. He completely recovers, I think, by that. An Inside Story I also consider a masterpiece. But I think The Zone of Interest is, if not at least the greatest book of his last octave, but potentially his greatest novel he's ever written.
Let's hear the first reading.
Okay, so this is the very beginning of the book where Thomsen has just fallen in love with Mrs. Dahl, Paul Dahl, the commandant's wife, Hannah. And he's finding a way to be alone with her in her house, and a Jewish house slave is walking around. So this is it begins with a dialogue between Thomsen and Hannah, and they're discussing Humilia, a Jewish slave. How old would you say she is? 35? She's 50. I think she looks like that because she thinks she's never going to die. Well, that would be very cheering. And it's also simple. She bent and poured, and we took our seats. Hannah on the quilted sofa, I on a rustic wooden chair. All she's got to do is sign a document, and that's the end of it. She's free. Just abjure, as they say. Yes, but Humilia couldn't be more devoted to my two girls, and she's got a child of her own, a boy of 12, who's in state care, and all she's got to do is sign a form and she can go and get him, and she doesn't. She won't. It's curious, isn't it? I'm told they're meant to like suffering, and I remembered Boris's description of a witness on the flogging post, but I would not be regaling Hannah with it, the way the witness pleaded for more. It gratifies their faith. Imagine. They love it. 7 o'clock was now nearing, and the room's blushful light suddenly dropped and settled. I had had many remarkable successes at this phase of the day, many startling successes, when the dusk, as yet unopposed by lamp or lantern, seems to confer an impalpable license, rumors of dream-strange possibilities. Would it be so unwelcome, really, if I quietly joined her on the sofa and, after some murmured compliments, took her hand and, depending on how that went, gently smoothed my lips against the base of her neck? Would it?
The dehumanization of the Jews in that passage is obvious. And it reminds me again of a scene from the film in which I believe Hedwig is talking about having found a diamond in a tube of toothpaste, one that clearly has been confiscated. But she says then jokingly, it made me want to order more toothpaste. You never know. They're very clever, aren't they? They're very clever.
I think that explains exactly why I picked it. You see the juxtapositional game that's going on here. You see the dehumanization in the dialogue. Meanwhile, it turns out actually at the very end of the novel that Hannah is Jewish, secretly Jewish, despite being the wife of the commandant. The commandant doesn't know this. So she's taking part in this dehumanization game too on the surface to keep appearances. But at the same time, then you get that switch to the sort of quintessential Amos, ironical, philandering, gorgeous prose. So Thomsen is playing this game with her, discussing these the banal dehumanization of the slave, or what they would maybe just consider a servant. But you see the revelation of this sort of gorgeous inner monologue that's going on with this Nazi officer, which creates that really uncomfortable dichotomy that's throughout the entire novel, is this achievement of aesthetic beauty in an evil person, in an evil situation. It's why I say it's sort of his Lolita in that sense.
You feel that you've arrived at what you consider his best novel, potentially in the zone of interest. Where did it begin, though?
Where did my journey with Amos begin? It actually began with Time's Arrow, which is interesting. I think there's something odd about Amos and he's most gorgeously at his ease, to borrow one of his phrases, I think, when dealing with the Holocaust, when coming right up against pure evil. But my journey did begin with Time's Arrow, and then I moved really sporadically. I think I had the benefit, I'm only 29, I had the benefit of not reading him chronologically. I think a lot of the undeserved criticism of him, the dismissal of him, I think comes from people who followed his work from the very beginning, who were disappointed with Yellow Dog, who I think were overly influenced by that terrible hit piece by Tibor Fischer about Yellow Dog. I think his critical appraisal, at least in America, maybe never fully recovered from that. But I was able to read him from a place of near posterity in a way. I began reading him, I think he died maybe 4 years into my reading of him, but I was able to begin reading him from not a place of being contemporary with him. And The Zone of Interest, I think I read, was maybe one of the last novels I read of his. But yeah, I find it interesting that he hasn't made the generational leap to my generation in America, at least. I was really heartened to meet all of these New Statesman editors after the panel discussion, who, if they didn't completely love him, at least had a huge respect for him and was aware of him. In America, it hasn't happened, and I think that's something that needs to be corrected and righted. I think it's showing, actually, in the sort of inconsistent state or poor quality of literary criticism of writing. I think not enough people are influenced by Martin Amis.
Particularly in America, you think?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Do you suspect there's a real reason why?
There is a gulf between American English and English. When Martin Amis is writing, even if it's a book I don't enjoy, his English is pitch perfect. He's never written a bad line, as far as I'm concerned. Even his novels that I think are inconsistent, they're incredibly readable books. He's so fluent. In America, I think people try not to be fluent with the English language in a way. I think they try to be, sometimes, especially young people, I think, try to be very jarring, and they're suspicious of something that sounds pretty. They're suspicious of melody in a way. They want to be stark and ugly in some of their writing.
Suspicious of melody, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think also, in a sense, literary talent has become Baroque in a way. I think it's looked at as people are suspicious of talent itself, and Amos, if he was anything, was pure talent. On the level of the phrase, Zone of Interest, I think, records the greatest phraselet in the English language, which I believe it's Paul describing his wife. It might be Thomsen. But anyways, she's in bed and her thighs are described as being gluily asquirm. And it's an incredibly beautiful phrase, gluily asquirm. I'll forever be trying to steal that or find a way to top that. I mean, I've never come across two words better glued together, shall we say.
It's very, I mean, to me, that's very Nabokov.
Definitely.
To just contrast for a moment where you see the biggest differences and what accounts, as you say, for that suspicion of melody versus what McCarthy offers, which is certainly not ugly, but it's much starker.
I think that's an interesting question because I think also McCarthy, his style at least, especially maybe his early style in Blood Meridian and Suttree, is polarizing, where I think some Americans look at it and go, oh yeah, he's just trying to do a modernist thing, fuck off, They're suspicious of it as well. I think his novels really hit the American sensibility. A lot of non-readers or first-time readers read Cormac McCarthy. They can read All the Pretty Horses or No Country for Old Men or The Road and say, oh, this is incredible, the way that they might pick up Hemingway and say, oh, this is actually worth my time to read. To contrast McCarthy with Amos, I think both of them play God in a way. I think McCarthy does it from the third person. He creates entire universes. His novels have cosmologies in them. Amos, on the other hand, plays the megalomane. He plays a narcissist. That's really where he hits his sweet spot, is in really locating the novel in voice. That's why Thomsen is such incredible writing. It's one of his best narrators, one of his best characters. So they both actually have a similar scope, but from different grammatical sides. Amos is more effete himself. He's more literary than McCarthy is, although McCarthy also has written some of the prettiest sounding sentences in the language. But I think I see Amos as being influenced by a school of literature that McCarthy disdained. I think Amos pays way too much credit to Bellow, certainly John Updike, Philip Roth. I think Amos was always looking for a lineage. You can see Kingsley is so present in Amos's work. I mean, that's obvious. It goes without saying. But I think he was always looking for a lineage. He was like a second generation reader and writer. He inherited that from his father. And so I think, but I think he was too influenced by the regnant American East Coast school of writing, which I think played in a transitional way into this sort of bland MFA uni style that we're stuck in.
You think Cormac McCarthy viewed these East Coast writers, Bellow, Roth, Mailer, etc., as digressing from a true American voice that resonated with the heartlands?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to remember too that he was contemporary with all these writers. Maybe a bit younger than but he was mostly contemporary with these writers, whereas Amos was of the generation right below. So Amos already had a respect for them as being younger. He wants to be in the realm that they occupy. With McCarthy, he was writing at the same time as these people and writing greater novels, but receiving no recognition, receiving no praise. I think he had respect for Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow was on the committee that granted McCarthy the MacArthur Foundation grant, the Genius Grant, which was life-changing for him. I think he respected Bellow as a writer, but so many of these novels, Bellow and Roth novels, are about writers or they're about professors. I mean,
yes,
they become so myopic where you really can only connect to them if you yourself are a writer. Or you yourself are so steeped already in this like literary community. You are a professor, an academic. I think this generation, including Updike, Mailer I leave to the side because he's an interesting case. But I credit Bellow, Roth, and Updike with shrinking American readership. They just wrote the same novels over and over again. And they appealed to a increasingly more exclusive sort of like literary elite.
Yeah.
That was becoming increasingly mediocre. I think Amos was too influenced by these writers.
They are nearly all, these writers, Jewish, and given that we're talking about the zone of interest, it's probably worth us talking about how potentially that comes out in the book. Again, I leave you to tell me to what extent you think that might be true.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword for him, and I think he didn't start calling himself a Philo-Semite until after awarding Bellow, Jewish American writer, the honorary title of being his literary father. And I think he felt a sort of artificial frustration, literary frustration at not being Jewish himself. And if we believe the biography that he authorized but then had quibbled with, Bradford, I'm forgetting his name, but it's called Martin Amos, the biography. If we can believe this anecdote, then when Christopher Hitchens, his best friend, discovered that he was a quarter Jewish and told Martin Amos, Amos had to sit down and collect himself, and I believe wept, and told Hitchens that he was envious.
Which is a strange reaction.
It is a strange reaction.
And what do you think was going on there? I mean, in a way, it's quite clear he was envious. But why do you think he was?
Well, now we're really going to psychologize him, speculatively. But his first love of his life was a beautiful Jewish woman. She's Rachel in the Rachel papers. He was attracted to Jewish women. He was attracted to the writing. I think Norman Mailer said about Gore Vidal that Gore Vidal lacked something crucial. He lacked the wound. A writer needs a wound. I think Amos also has this problem where he's superbly talented, but he is lacking potentially a psychological wound that needs to be worked through creatively in a way. I think you can see in some writers, Hemingway, for instance, the whole iceberg theory, he's talented, he knows how to write a novel, but there's also a pain in him. And I think pain can translate well to art. It's a core component. I think Amos maybe saw in the Jewish tradition, if I were Jewish, I'd have some trauma to be writing from, and this is complete speculation. But I think it's true. Right? And like he said about John Updike when Updike died, he said of Updike, he alone could hold his head high with the great Jews. And that's Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, who I don't really think of as a Jewish writer, even though he is technically, and Singer. And Singer, I don't know why he's included in there. He wrote one very good book, but I think Amos threw him in there just to make the list seem a little bit more comprehensible. But there's an irony too that, of course, the only Gentile that Amos throws into this list of like the great novelists of the last half of the 20th century, his initials are pronounced Jew, John Updike. I think he created a little literary fetish for himself. And he tried to write within it. I think he envied it. He wanted to be part of that lineage and that tradition. I think he thought it would round him out as a writer, which is why in his last 8 books, so many of them contain a beautiful Jewish woman is like the love interest. Hannah Dahl turns out to be Jewish. House of Meetings there's such an absurdity to the House of Meetings where the main character is this horrible, evil, violent man. He murders, he rapes, he took part gleefully in World War II in massacres, but he every few, dozen pages, he has to stop and wonder, how could people be anti-Semitic, He's like violently against Jewish pogroms, but it's like, this makes no sense in this character. This character is like pure evil, but yet he has this weird moral vibrancy when it comes to anti-Semitism. It ruins that character in the novel. It's just not consistent. He created a fetish out of it, but yet it's when he actually does fully confront the Holocaust that he then did create potentially his greatest novel of all time, The Zone of Interest.
Yes, I get the impression, the more I think about it, that Kingsley Amis, who was a low-key anti-Semite in his own way, felt to Martin, I think, as he came of age and realized his ambition to become a writer, just too provincial, and wanted to look at bigger narratives that affected lives at scale. And these writers, Bellow, Nabokov, Updike, Mailer, etc., they were dealing with that. They were dealing with the new world, its diasporas, all of its new challenges. And that would have been exciting to a post-war child in Martin Amis who had this ambition to write about important things.
No, I think that's a great point. I think he was after the big themes. And those would certainly be the writers that you would look to as contending with those themes and learning from. And I don't mean to completely dismiss them. They're incredible writers. I think Bellow is one of the great prose stylists of all time. I think Mailer, when he fails, is very exciting. Even when he writes a terrible novel or he goes too far in all directions, and there's something brilliant about it. Updike is I have such a love-hate thing with him. As some phrases, let's just say in couples, are worthy of Nabokov, but the novel itself, I think is a failure. But what's very interesting too is that in all of Amos's literary criticism, it presupposes an American landscape that doesn't include Thomas Pynchon and doesn't include Cormac McCarthy. There's so many writers that just don't exist and this is not just an Amos problem, but it's a myopia, I think, of that generation. There's certain American writers that just don't exist to these people.
I mean, has he ever talked about Pynchon?
He mentioned him once in a review in an offhand way, and not in a dismissive way, but he mentioned him, I think in a review of one of Don DeLillo's books. He loved DeLillo, or at least he had a phase where he did in the 90s, I think. And it's strange, but it's also understandable in the sense that I think so many people of that generation are.
Right.
You know, like Salman Rushdie doesn't talk about Cormac McCarthy.
No.
Ian McEwan doesn't. You know, to this generation, I think these writers just don't exist, or they're passé. They're not worth reading. I think they have some of them have a similar dismissal of Hemingway, where it's like, why bother? It's one dimensional.
I can see that too. Yeah.
And I think they look at McCarthy, if they do, this is again pure speculation, but I think they would look at him as being in the same school of writing. You know. It's so single entendre, you know. Where's the irony? It doesn't concern Cormac McCarthy's never written a book about a writer, you know. I think there's a big cleavage in contemporary literature where you have some novels written about non-writers, and then you have a whole school of writing, a very insular, incestuous school that's written almost exclusively about writers or about professors or about these very nichely pseudo-intellectual characters.
Do you think they wrote for writers? His point about being a good host to your reader would suggest that writing for other writers was absolutely not what he was trying to do. But I think he believed that, you know, there is a class of people who do this for a living and they are accountable to one another. So long as that translates well to the reader, you've done your job. But certainly you have to answer to your peers in this literary writers club.
I think that's a good point. I will say about Amos, though, that even though he was part of a literary class and potentially wrote too much for that class, he alone out of that group of writers, I think, is the most appealing. I mean, he's one of my favorite writers ever. I would put him, Cormac McCarthy, Nabokov. I think those are my big three. And I respect, you know, the artistry and the talent of Julian Barnes and Ian McEwan and Salman Rushdie, but those novels just don't do it for me, whereas Martin Amos does. And I don't consider myself part of a literary class either. I don't consider myself as trying to write for a literary class, but yet Amos appeals to me. So there's something special about Amos as well. I think just in the pure raw talent of his prose, that if you just like literature, you like writing, you like reading, you will like Martin Amos. You can't read, I don't think you could read London Fields and not say this is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read. You know, I think in that sense he brushes shoulders with the greatest writers of all time because he has that dual appeal. He appeals to writers, he's like a writer's writer, but I think he's also a reader's writer in so many ways. And I think he is a good host. There's something sleek and quick about him in most of his books. Even if they're not full successes, they're eminently readable.
It's a very fine balance that I believe, as you do, he struck. You know, he said he developed a high style to describe low things.
I think that's maybe what's so brilliant about The Zone of Interest is that it's high style wrestling with evil. That's his achievement. It is some of his most frictionless prose, some of his most beautiful melodic prose, some of his best characters, some of his most poignant, I guess, comic absurdities. You know, Paul Dahl there's Humbert in Paul Dahl. There's Humbert also in Thomsen in different ways. There's a great conversation he has with Clive James on YouTube. Clive James had some series where they're talking about, can you be a bad person but make beautiful art? I think they're talking about Celine, and they're talking about some of the writers under the Soviet regime. And they came to some conclusion that to really achieve a high aesthetic, there's something moral about it. But I think this is the question that's undertaken with the Zone of Interest, with Time's Arrow as well, is can you achieve high aesthetic beauty on the German side of the wall? And that aesthetic beauty has to do also with real dark irony, and some absurdity. It's not a validation or acceptance of what happened. It's double entendre on the other side of the wall. But it's some of his best prose. It's some of his best artistry.
So which passage would you choose to close out this episode, Vincenzo?
I'll do a little bit of Paul Dahl, the commandant, here. You'll see in this passage the mediocre absurdity of this character and of the humans that conducted the most evil crime in human history. In the washroom of the Officers' Club, what do I find but a copy of Der Stürmer? Now, this publication has for some time been banned in the KL, and on my orders. With its disgusting and hysterical emphasis on the carnal predations of the Jewish male, Der Stürmer, I believe, has done serious anti-Semitism a great deal of harm. The people need to see charts, diagrams, statistics, the scientific evidence, and not a full-page cartoon of Shylock, as it might be, slavering over Rapunzel. I am far from alone in this view. It is the policy championed by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt itself. In Dachau, where I launched my meteoric rise through the custodial hierarchy, a display case of Der Stürmers was erected in the prisoners' canteen. It had a galvanizing effect on the criminal element, and violence frequently ensued. Our Jewish brethren wormed their way out of it in typical fashion, with bribes, as they all had plenty of money. Besides, they were mainly persecuted by their co-religionists, notably Eskin, their block senior. The Jews were, of course, aware that over the long term this foul rag actually helped their cause rather than hindered it. I offer the following as a footnote. It is well known that the editor of Der Stürmer is himself a Jew, and he also writes the worst of the incendiary articles it features. I rest my case. I was halfway to the door when I was struck by an unpleasant thought. It so happens that I have not yet seen the balance sheet for Special Train 105. And I left the little brown bower that evening without specifically telling Wolfram Prüfer to bury the pieces in the spring meadow. Was he stupid enough to fire up a Topf & Sons 3 retorter to deal with a smattering of brats and dodderers? Surely not. No. Wiser heads would have prevailed. Prüfer would have listened to one of the old hands, for example, Szmul. Oh, Christ, what am I going on about? If Horst Blobel meant what he said, then the whole bloody lot of them all have to come up anyway. I see I'd better have a brood about this. I'll sleep in the dressing room, as usual, and tackle Hannah in the morning. One of those ones where you slip in beside them whilst they're all warm and somnolent, and ease up against them and into them. I won't stand for any hogwash, and then we'll both be in excellent spirits for our little gathering here at the villa. For I am a normal man with normal needs. I am completely normal. This is what nobody seems to understand. Paul Dahl is completely normal.
I can't wait to read this novel. So thank you, Vincenzo, for joining me and for bringing Cormac McCarthy into the conversation as well. Another big thank you, and you're very welcome for staying.
Well, thank you so much, Jack. It's really been an honor, and let's go buy some good books.
That's it. We're off to Soho now. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.